Moscow, Soviet Union, March 17, 1983. Dr. Viktor Petrov, a senior nuclear physicist at the Kurchatov Institute, responsible for advancing Soviet thermonuclear weapon miniaturization research that would enable the deployment of multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles on next-generation intercontinental ballistic missiles, sat in the back seat of a black Volga sedan, believing he was being driven to an exclusive diplomatic reception at the Dutch embassy, where he would spend several hours networking with Western scientists and diplomats in conversations that would be carefully monitored by KGB handlers who accompanied Soviet scientists to any events involving foreign nationals. What Petrov did not know was that the invitation he had received 3 weeks earlier was entirely fabricated by the CIA, that the driver of the vehicle was not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs chauffeur whose credentials appeared authentic, but was instead a deep-cover CIA operative who had spent 6 years establishing his identity within Soviet bureaucratic structures, that the KGB handlers he believed were following in a separate vehicle had been delayed by a staged traffic accident 2 kilometers behind his current position, and that within 90 minutes he would be sedated, concealed inside a diplomatic cargo container, and transported across the Finnish border in an operation that represented one of the most audacious CIA extractions ever conducted on Soviet territory during the Cold War. The operation to kidnap Viktor Petrov represented the culmination of CIA planning that had begun 18 months earlier when Signals Intelligence Intercepts and Human Source Reporting had identified Petrov as possessing detailed knowledge of Soviet nuclear weapons development that would be invaluable to Western intelligence services and that could not be obtained through technical collection methods because the research was conducted in facilities that were isolated from electronic communications networks and were protected by security measures that prevented satellite imagery from capturing meaningful information about the work being performed inside. The CIA had determined that Petrov's knowledge was sufficiently valuable to justify the extraordinary risks associated with conducting a kidnapping operation inside the Soviet Union, risks that included the possibility of armed confrontation with Soviet security forces, the potential for diplomatic crisis if the operation was exposed before Petrov could be extracted from Soviet territory, and the certainty that successful execution would require coordination among multiple CIA elements, including the Moscow station officers who would manage operational details, the Technical Services Division personnel who would create the documentary deception materials and specialized equipment needed for the extraction, and the paramilitary operations officers who would handle the physical aspects of the kidnapping and transportation. Viktor Petrov had been born in Leningrad in 1941, months before the German invasion that would result in the siege that killed hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens, including Petrov's father, who died of starvation in the winter of 1942. Petrov's mother had survived the siege and had raised Viktor in conditions of poverty that characterized post-war Soviet society. But Petrov had demonstrated exceptional mathematical aptitude that had been identified by Soviet educational authorities who channeled academically gifted students into specialized schools that prepared them for university studies in scientific and technical fields that supported Soviet industrial and military development. Petrov had been admitted to Moscow State University in 1959, where he studied physics, and had been recruited upon graduation into the Soviet nuclear weapons program, a program that absorbed the most talented physics graduates and that offered privileged living conditions, access to restricted goods, and professional prestige that made nuclear weapons work one of the most desirable careers available to Soviet scientists who were willing to accept the security restrictions and the isolation from international scientific communities that came with working on classified military research. By the early 1980s, Petrov had risen to become one of the Soviet Union's leading experts in thermonuclear weapons design, specifically in the engineering challenges associated with miniaturizing warheads to weights and dimensions that would allow multiple warheads to be carried on a single missile, technology that would dramatically increase Soviet nuclear strike capabilities by allowing each intercontinental ballistic missile to attack multiple targets simultaneously, and that would complicate Western defensive planning by multiplying doubling the number of incoming warheads that missile defense systems would need to intercept. Petrov's work had involved solving complex problems related to how nuclear materials could be configured to achieve maximum explosive yield while minimizing weight and volume, how electronic components could be hardened to survive the extreme accelerations and vibrations of missile launch and the radiation environment of nuclear detonation, and how multiple warheads could be packaged together with guidance systems and penetration aids that would help them evade defensive systems, problems that required both theoretical understanding of nuclear physics and practical engineering knowledge of materials, electronics, and mechanical systems. Western intelligence services had been attempting to gather information about Soviet nuclear weapons development through various technical collection methods, including satellite imagery that could show the external characteristics of weapons systems during testing, signals intelligence that could intercept communications about weapons programs, and seismic monitoring that could analyze the characteristics of underground nuclear tests to estimate weapon yields and designs. These technical methods provided valuable information but had significant limitations because they could not reveal the detailed internal designs of weapons, the specific technical problems Soviet scientists were encountering and solving, the timeline for deployment of new weapon systems, or the full scope of Soviet nuclear capabilities that were being developed in underground facilities that were protected against overhead reconnaissance. Human intelligence from sources with direct access to Soviet nuclear weapons programs was extremely difficult to obtain because the scientists and engineers who worked on these programs were subject to intensive security screening, were monitored continuously by KGB security personnel, had limited contact with foreigners who might attempt recruitment, and faced severe penalties including execution for espionage if caught providing information to Western intelligence services. The CIA had maintained several long-term operations attempting to recruit Soviet nuclear scientists, operations that involved identifying scientists who might be vulnerable to recruitment approaches due to financial problems, personal grievances against Soviet authorities, ideological disillusionment, or other factors that might motivate them to cooperate with Western intelligence. These recruitment operations had achieved limited success because Soviet security measures made it extremely difficult to approach scientists without detection, and because the risks of recruitment were so severe that few scientists were willing to cooperate even when approached with attractive offers. The CIA had concluded that obtaining detailed information about Soviet nuclear weapons development would require either successful recruitment of a well-placed source, which appeared increasingly unlikely given the effectiveness of Soviet counterintelligence, or extraction of a scientist who could be debriefed outside Soviet territory, an option that would require kidnapping because Soviet nuclear scientists were never allowed to travel abroad without extensive security oversight that would make voluntary defection nearly impossible to accomplish. The initial intelligence that identified Viktor Petrov as a potential target for extraction came from a KGB officer who had been recruited by the CIA in 1980 and who provided information about Soviet nuclear scientists, including their work assignments, their personal characteristics, their travel patterns, and their security arrangements. This source, whom the CIA designated with the cryptonym archaeologist, had reported that Petrov was considered one of the most knowledgeable Soviet experts on warhead miniaturization, that he occasionally attended diplomatic receptions and cultural events where he could interact with Western scientists and diplomats in settings that were monitored by KGB but that offered more freedom of movement than most Soviet scientists experienced, and that Petrov's security detail followed standard protocols that might be vulnerable to deception operations if conducted with sufficient sophistication and if timed to exploit specific circumstances that would temporarily separate Petrov from his handlers. The CIA's Soviet East European Division had begun serious planning for the Petrov extraction in September 1981 after reviewing archaeologists' reporting and after conducting detailed assessment of whether extraction would be operationally feasible and whether the intelligence value justified the risks. The assessment had concluded that Petrov's knowledge would be sufficiently valuable to justify a high-risk operation, that the operational environment in Moscow offered certain opportunities that could be exploited, including the regular diplomatic receptions where Soviet scientists mixed with foreigners, that CIA technical capabilities had advanced to the point where sufficient sophisticated deception operations could be executed with reasonable probability of success, and that the timing was favorable because Soviet security services were focused on other priorities, including monitoring dissident movements and countering Western intelligence operations directed against military and political targets, focus that might create opportunities for an audacious operation that fell outside the normal patterns Soviet counterintelligence was expecting to detect. The extraction plan that CIA operations officers developed involved creating an entirely fictitious diplomatic reception that would appear legitimate to both Petrov and to his KGB handlers, using the false event to separate Petrov from his security detail through staged circumstances that would not raise immediate suspicion, kidnapping Petrov once he was isolated from his handlers, and transporting him out of the Soviet Union through a route that would minimize the time Soviet authorities would have to establish roadblocks or to seal borders once Petrov's disappearance was discovered. The plan required extensive preparation, including creation of forged invitation materials that would pass KGB scrutiny, establishment of CIA operatives in positions that would allow them to execute the kidnapping, development of specialized equipment, including the diplomatic cargo container that would be used to conceal Petrov during extraction, and coordination with CIA elements outside the Soviet Union who would receive Petrov once he crossed into friendly territory and would manage his subsequent debriefing and resettlement. The fabrication of the false diplomatic reception began with CIA operations officers identifying the Dutch embassy as the venue that would be used in the cover story, a selection based on several factors including that the Netherlands maintained active cultural and scientific exchange programs with the Soviet Union that made a reception for scientists plausible, that the Dutch embassy regularly hosted events that Soviet scientists attended, that the embassy's location in central Moscow provided multiple route options for transportation that would give CIA operational flexibility, and that Dutch diplomatic protocols would be familiar enough to KGB officials reviewing the invitation that they would not detect anomalies that might raise suspicion. CIA Technical Services Division personnel created invitation documents that replicated authentic Dutch embassy stationery, that included proper formatting and language consistent with genuine diplomatic invitations, that referenced real Dutch embassy officials whose names and titles were known to Soviet authorities, and that described a reception honoring scientific cooperation between Dutch and Soviet research institutions, an event type that occurred regularly enough that its existence would not seem unusual to KGB officials reviewing whether Petrov should be permitted to attend. The invitation was delivered to Petrov through channels that appeared legitimate, specifically through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Cultural Liaison Office that normally processed invitations for Soviet scientists to attend diplomatic events, delivery that was accomplished by a CIA operative who had been placed within the ministry's administrative staff through an operation that had taken 3 years to establish, and that involved the operative assuming the identity of a deceased Soviet citizen whose background had been thoroughly documented to withstand background checks. The invitation reached Petrov in late February 1983 and included the standard requirements that he confirm his attendance through official channels, and that he would be accompanied by designated KGB personnel who would ensure appropriate conduct during the event, requirements that were normal for any Soviet scientist attending events with foreigners, and that would not raise concerns about the invitation's authenticity. Petrov had confirmed his attendance and had been approved by KGB authorities who reviewed the invitation and determined that the event was legitimate and that Petrov's attendance would serve Soviet interests by maintaining good relations with Dutch scientists and diplomats who might provide useful information about Western scientific developments or who might be vulnerable to recruitment as Soviet intelligence sources. The KGB had assigned 2 handlers to accompany Petrov to the reception, officers whose responsibilities included monitoring Petrov's conversations, preventing unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information, and ensuring that Petrov returned directly to his apartment after the event concluded, standard security procedures that Soviet authorities applied to all scientists working on classified programs when they had any contact with foreign nationals. The CIA's operational plan required separating Petrov from his KGB handlers in a manner that would not immediately alert them that something was wrong. Separation that would provide the brief window needed to kidnap Petrov and begin his extraction before Soviet authorities could respond. The separation would be accomplished through a staged traffic accident that would delay the KGB handler's vehicle while allowing Petrov's vehicle to continue to what the handlers would believe was the embassy reception. An accident that would appear to be a normal traffic incident, but that would be severe enough to require the handlers to stop and render assistance or to provide official statements. Delay that would give CIA operatives time to kidnap Petrov and begin moving him toward the extraction route before the handlers realized something was wrong. On March 17, 1983, the operation began when Petrov was picked up at his apartment building by what appeared to be an official Ministry of Foreign Affairs driver in a black Volga sedan that was identical to vehicles used for transporting scientists to diplomatic events. The driver, who was actually a CIA operative named Thomas Kendrick, who had spent 6 years establishing his cover identity as a Soviet citizen working in government motor pool services, presented credentials that appeared authentic and that matched records in ministry databases that had been altered by another CIA operative with access to administrative systems. Petrov entered the vehicle without suspicion, and the sedan departed toward central Moscow, followed at a distance by a second vehicle carrying the two KGB handlers who were assigned to monitor Petrov during the reception. The route toward the Dutch embassy had been carefully planned to pass through areas where CIA surveillance teams could monitor progress and where the staged accident could be executed at a location that would maximize separation time between Petrov and his handlers. At 6:47 p.m., approximately 15 minutes after departing Petrov's apartment, and at a location 2 kilometers from the embassy, a truck that had been positioned at an intersection by CIA operatives suddenly pulled into the path of the handler's vehicle, causing a collision that was severe enough to disable both vehicles, but that did not cause serious injuries to the occupants. The accident appeared to be the result of the truck driver's error, and the KGB handlers, believing this was a normal traffic incident, stopped to assess damage and to provide identification to militia officers who would respond to the accident. Officers who were genuine Soviet traffic police, but who had been directed to the location by an anonymous tip about illegal parking that ensured they would be nearby when the accident occurred and would respond quickly. Response that would keep the handlers occupied with official procedures. Kendrick, driving Petrov's vehicle, had continued toward the embassy after the accident and had radioed to the handlers that he would proceed with Petrov to ensure they arrived on time for the reception and that the handlers could follow once the accident was resolved. Communication that followed standard protocols and that did not raise immediate suspicion. The handlers had agreed because they assumed Petrov would be safe at the heavily guarded embassy and that they could join him there within 30 minutes once the accident documentation was completed. This assumption was exactly what CIA planners had anticipated and had exploited because it gave them the window of separation they needed to execute the kidnapping before the handlers realized Petrov was not actually at the embassy. Instead of driving to the Dutch embassy, Kendrick turned onto a side street 3 blocks from the embassy location and pulled into an enclosed courtyard behind a building that appeared to be under renovation, but that was actually a CIA safe house that had been established specifically for this operation. As soon as the vehicle entered the courtyard, the gates closed and 2 additional CIA operatives emerged from the building and approached the sedan. Petrov, realizing something was wrong, attempted to exit the vehicle but was restrained by Kendrick, while one of the other operatives administered a fast-acting sedative through an injection that rendered Petrov unconscious within seconds. The sedative had been specifically selected because it would keep Petrov unconscious for approximately 4 hours, enough time to move him to the extraction point and across the border, but would not cause lasting medical effects that might complicate his eventual interrogation and debriefing. Petrov's unconscious body was quickly moved from the sedan into the building, where he was placed inside a specially constructed diplomatic cargo container that had been designed to appear as routine diplomatic cargo being transported to the Finnish border for shipment to Western Europe. The container had been modified to include air supply systems that would keep Petrov alive during transportation, padding that would prevent injury from movement during transit, and monitoring equipment that would allow CIA operatives to verify that Petrov remained unconscious and that his vital signs remained stable. The container was sealed and loaded onto a truck that carried diplomatic license plates and that was staffed by CIA operatives posing as embassy personnel, transporting diplomatic materials to Finland, cover that would allow them to pass through checkpoints without inspection because diplomatic cargo enjoyed immunity from search under international agreements that the Soviet Union respected to ensure their own diplomatic shipments received similar treatment abroad. The truck departed the safe house at 7:23 p.m., exactly 36 minutes after Petrov had been picked up from his apartment and just 8 minutes before the KGB handlers completed the accident documentation and attempted to radio Kendrick about their arrival at the embassy. When the handlers received no response to their radio calls, they initially assumed technical problems with the communications equipment. But after arriving at the Dutch embassy at 7:35 p.m. and discovering that no reception was scheduled and that Petrov had not arrived, they immediately realized that something was seriously wrong and contacted KGB headquarters to report that Petrov was missing and that they had been separated from him through what now appeared to be a deliberately staged accident. The KGB response was immediate and massive, with orders issued to militia and security forces throughout Moscow to establish checkpoints and to search for Petrov and for the black Volga sedan that had transported him. However, the CIA's operational planning had anticipated this response and had incorporated several elements designed to delay Soviet ability to determine what had actually happened and where Petrov had been taken. Kendrick and the sedan had been moved to a different safehouse location where the vehicle would be concealed and eventually destroyed, eliminating physical evidence that might help Soviet investigators. False reports were fed through compromised sources suggesting that Petrov might have defected voluntarily and might be hiding in Moscow while attempting to make contact with Western embassies, reports that caused KGB to focus significant resources on surveillance of embassy locations and on searching apartments and locations where a defector might hide rather than focusing on border crossing points. The truck carrying Petrov had already traveled more than 100 kilometers toward the Finnish border before KGB headquarters issued orders to establish checkpoints, distance that meant the truck passed through the most heavily controlled areas around Moscow before Soviet authorities realized they should be looking for diplomatic vehicles that might be involved in the extraction. The route to the Finnish border had been planned to use highways and roads that would allow maximum speed while avoiding checkpoints that might be established quickly. And the truck's diplomatic status meant that even when it encountered militia officers at routine checkpoints, it could not be stopped or searched without violating diplomatic immunity. The truck reached the border crossing at Valima at 3:17 a.m. on March 18th, approximately 8 hours after Petrov had been kidnapped, and passed through the crossing using diplomatic credentials that Soviet border guards were required to honor. Once across the border, Petrov was transferred to a CIA aircraft that had been waiting at a secure location in Finland and was flown to Frankfurt, where he would begin extensive debriefing by CIA and Allied intelligence services about Soviet nuclear weapons development. Petrov regained consciousness approximately 4 hours after the sedative had been administered and initially believed he had been involved in a car accident and was being treated at a hospital. When CIA officers informed him that he had been kidnapped and was now in Western custody, Petrov's reaction was one of shock and anger, emotions that persisted for several days as he processed the reality that he would not be returning to the Soviet Union and that his life had been permanently altered by an operation he had no voice in authorizing. CIA psychologists worked with Petrov to help him adjust to his situation and to establish rapport that would facilitate his cooperation with debriefing. Cooperation that was not automatic because Petrov had not chosen to defect and initially expressed loyalty to the Soviet Union and reluctance to provide information that would damage Soviet national security. The approach CIA officers used with Petrov involved presenting him with the reality that he could not return to the Soviet Union regardless of whether he cooperated because Soviet authorities would assume he had been compromised and would likely execute him as a traitor or at minimum would imprison him for failing to prevent his own kidnapping. This assessment was accurate because KGB protocols required that any Soviet citizen who had been captured by Western intelligence services be presumed to have provided information regardless of their actual cooperation and be treated as a security threat that required elimination. CIA officers offered Petrov protection, resettlement in the West with a new identity, financial security, and the opportunity to continue scientific work in a non-classified context, options that represented his best path forward, given that return to the Soviet Union was not viable. Over a period of several weeks, Petrov gradually accepted his situation and began cooperating with CIA debriefing, cooperation that would provide Western intelligence services with detailed insights into Soviet nuclear weapons capabilities that had not been available through technical collection methods. The debriefing sessions with Petrov extended over 6 months and covered every aspect of Soviet nuclear weapons development that Petrov had knowledge of, including the specific designs of warheads he had worked on, the technical problems Soviet scientists were attempting to solve, the materials and manufacturing processes used in weapons production, the organizational structure of Soviet nuclear research institutions, the names and specializations of other scientists working on weapons programs, the timeline for deployment of new weapon systems that were under development, and the gaps in Soviet capabilities that constrained their weapons development. The information Petrov provided allowed Western intelligence analysts to assess that Soviet nuclear weapons capabilities were somewhat less advanced than had been feared based on incomplete technical intelligence, that Soviet scientists were encountering significant technical problems with warhead miniaturization that would delay deployment of next-generation missiles, that Soviet weapons production was limited by shortages of certain specialized materials and by quality control problems in manufacturing facilities, and that Soviet research priorities indicated they were concerned about specific Western defensive technologies that appeared to be more effective than Soviet planners had anticipated. The intelligence from Petrov's debriefing was incorporated into Western strategic planning and contributed to decisions about defense spending priorities, about arms control negotiation positions, and about military preparedness measures that would be needed to counter Soviet nuclear capabilities. The information also provided specific technical details that helped Western scientists understand Soviet weapons designs and identify potential vulnerabilities that might be exploited in defensive systems, though the extent to which Petrov's information directly influenced military capabilities remained classified and was not disclosed to avoid revealing to Soviet authorities exactly what had been compromised by his kidnapping. The Soviet response to Petrov's disappearance evolved as KGB investigations determined that he had been kidnapped by Western intelligence services rather than having defected voluntarily, determination that was based on analysis of the staged traffic accident, on discovery of the safe house where Petrov had been sedated, and on intelligence reporting from Soviet sources in the West who confirmed that Petrov had been seen in CIA custody. Soviet authorities conducted extensive investigations to identify how the operation had been executed and to determine whether other compromises of security systems had occurred that would indicate broader CIA penetration of Soviet institutions. These investigations led to identification and arrest of several individuals who had facilitated the operation, including the CIA operative who had been placed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and who had delivered the false invitation, though other CIA operatives involved in the operation successfully concealed their roles and continued operating undercover in Moscow for several more years until they were exfiltrated through separate operations. The diplomatic consequences of the Petrov kidnapping were significant, but were managed through channels that allowed both sides to avoid public escalation that might have damaged broader diplomatic relations that both superpowers had interest in maintaining. Soviet authorities protested through official diplomatic channels that the CIA had violated Soviet sovereignty and had conducted a criminal kidnapping operation on Soviet territory. Protests that were ritualistic and expected, but that were not accompanied by retaliatory actions that might have escalated tensions. Western governments officially denied any knowledge of Petrov's whereabouts and characterized Soviet allegations as propaganda, denials that were also ritualistic and that both sides understood were false, but that maintained plausible deniability that allowed the incident to be contained without triggering broader crisis. The long-term impact of the Petrov extraction was multifaceted, affecting both intelligence operations and broader Cold War dynamics. For the CIA, the operation demonstrated that audacious operations could succeed even in highly controlled environments like Moscow if they were planned meticulously, and if they exploited specific vulnerabilities in security systems, though the operation also revealed risks because several CIA operatives were compromised and because Soviet counterintelligence became more vigilant about potential deception operations after learning how the Petrov kidnapping had been executed. For the Soviet Union, the operation revealed weaknesses in security procedures that protected nuclear scientists and prompted reforms including more restrictive protocols for scientist movements, elimination of diplomatic receptions where scientists could interact with foreigners without continuous monitoring, and enhanced background screening of personnel who had access to scientists or to facilities where classified research was conducted. Viktor Petrov lived the remainder of his life under a false identity in the United States, where he worked as a consultant for defense contractors on non-classified projects, and where he maintained contact with CIA personnel who managed his resettlement and security. He never reconciled fully with the circumstances of his kidnapping and expressed regret about being separated from his family and from his homeland, though he acknowledged that cooperation with CIA debriefing had been his best option given the impossibility of returning to the Soviet Union. He died in 1997 from natural causes, his true identity and his role in Cold War intelligence operations remaining classified until partial declassification of CIA records decades later revealed the operation and its significance. The fake diplomatic reception operation that enabled Viktor Petrov's kidnapping represented one of the CIA's most sophisticated deception operations of the Cold War period, an operation that succeeded through meticulous attention to detail in creating the false event, through exploitation of standard Soviet security procedures that created predictable vulnerabilities, through precise timing that maximized the window between kidnapping and Soviet response, and through use of diplomatic immunity protocols that allowed extraction before Soviet authorities could seal borders. The operation yielded intelligence about Soviet nuclear weapons capabilities that informed Western strategic planning for years afterward and demonstrated the value that human intelligence sources could provide when technical collection methods reached their limitations in penetrating closed societies with effective counterintelligence systems.